Hi there. My name's Eleanor Harper. I built this company brick by brick, 40 years of my life. But last month, my daughter-in-law, now the CEO, looked me dead in the eye and said, "No room here for washed-up deadweights." They took down my name, erased my legacy, and acted like I was never there. But what they didn't know is that I was still watching, and I remember everything. Stick around. What they tried to bury is about to come back to light. They took down the plaque while I was making tea. The hallway smelled the same polished wood stale office air and the faint trace of someone's expensive perfume. But the lighting felt colder than she remembered. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed overhead, flickering against the polished floor tiles like a scene Eleanor Harper no longer belonged to. She walked slowly, her heels muffled on the thin carpet. No one greeted her. Some heads turned briefly curious, maybe even confused. A young man in a fitted blazer offered a stiff smile, clearly unsure who she was. There used to be a plaque here. Eleanor knew the exact spot. To the left of the conference room door, beneath the framed first contract Harper Row had ever signed. It bore her name, and James's, their shared legacy, carved in bronze. But now the wall was bare, smooth, sterile. She paused, pressing her fingers gently against where the plaque used to be. A chill passed through her bones, but she kept her posture steady. In the boardroom, the air had turned clinical. Chelsea sat at the head of the table, confident, flawless, in a navy power suit. Ethan was beside her shoulders, hunched, scrolling absently on his phone. No one stood as Eleanor entered. No one pulled out her chair. She sat slowly, ignoring the ache in her knees. "We appreciate you joining us." Eleanor Chelsea began, her tone perfectly calibrated. "There have been some exciting changes." Eleanor didn't respond. She looked at Ethan. He didn't look up. Chelsea continued. "As part of our restructuring, the board has unanimously agreed to sunset certain honorary roles, titles that no longer align with the company's strategic trajectory." Eleanor's throat felt dry. She reached into her purse, clutching the key to her office just to feel it. She kept her gaze level. "You're saying I'm no longer part of Harper Row?" she said, her voice low, measured. Chelsea smiled as if explaining something to a child. "You'll always be a part of our history. But going forward, we must prioritize roles that contribute operational value." Operational value. Eleanor looked once more at her son. Ethan adjusted his cufflink. The meeting ended quickly. No handshake, no farewell. Just a subtle shuffle of chairs and the soft clink of water glasses being moved aside. Eleanor walked to the elevator. Her legs felt strangely light, like they no longer belonged to her. At home, the house was silent. The kind of silence that filled in slowly, like fog creeping under doors. She placed her bag on the counter, shrugged off her coat, and reached for the kettle. The same white ceramic teacup sat waiting. There was a faint crack near the handle, thin like a hairline. She noticed it last week, had meant to replace it, but now it felt necessary. Steam rose, curling into the air like ghosts. Her hand trembled slightly as she poured, but the cup held. No spill, no mess. She sat in the window seat, the one facing the old maple tree. She didn't turn on the TV. She didn't pick up the book left open on the side table. She just sat, breathing, swallowing the taste of what had been said without ever being said. After a long while, she stood again. Her trash needed to go out. That was something she could control. In the building's lobby, she passed the janitor's cart near the elevator. A black trash bag sat beside it, partly open. Something metal caught her eye. She leaned in. Inside her old nameplate. Eleanor Harper, co-founder. Still polished, still intact. tossed in among paper towels and an empty sandwich wrapper. She didn't reach for it. She didn't flinch. Back upstairs, the tea had gone cold. She picked up the cup, took a sip. I didn't cry, but the tea tasted bitter that day. My ID card still opened the door, but no one looked up. The door beeped faintly as Eleanor pressed her card against the reader. A satisfying click. Mechanically, it still knew her. It welcomed her without question. That was something. She stepped into the lobby of Harper Row, breathing in the sterile blend of industrial carpet and freshly brewed coffee. It should have felt familiar. She had overseen the installation of those very tiles, had argued for natural light panels, even selected the calming grey for the walls. But nothing felt hers anymore. The receptionist didn't glance up. She was new, young, crisp, tapping briskly on her keyboard with long acrylic nails. Eleanor offered a small nod. Nothing in return. She moved past the waiting area, her steps slower than usual. A man in a security uniform passed her, gave a quick glance, then looked away. He didn't stop her. Didn't greet her either. As she reached the second floor, the hum of morning emails and muted conversations floated in the air. Eleanor walked quietly, her hand trailing the wall like it might remind the building of her presence. She paused near a glass-walled conference room. Inside, people shuffled papers, pointed at slides, nodded at Chelsea's polished presentation. Through the glass, Eleanor saw her daughter-in-law's perfect posture and clipped gestures. She looked entirely at home. No one noticed Eleanor standing there. The Harper Row website glowed on a nearby screen. She moved closer, peering in. Her name was gone. The About Us page now read, founded by James Harper in 1987. Revitalized under the visionary leadership of Chelsea Rowe Harper. Revitalized. As if the decades in between had withered into nothing. She turned, heading to what used to be her office. Now it was labeled Operations Review. Her hand hesitated at the doorknob. She didn't open it. Instead, she moved to the common work area, the long row of desks where she had often stopped to chat, to share advice, to leave notes of encouragement. A young woman, Emily, perhaps glanced up briefly as Eleanor approached. Recognition flickered across her face, then extinguished just as fast. She looked back down, typing quickly. Eleanor stood for a moment. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, her voice soft. Emily didn't pause. "I think you might be the CEO's mother, not founder, not Eleanor Harper." She smiled almost gently. That's one way to put it. She moved on, not waiting for a reply. In the records room, one of the few spaces that still smelled the same, she unlocked the cabinet labeled Legacy Documents. Inside, where her handwritten project notes and long-term plans used to rest there, was only a single slip of paper taped to the empty shelf. Archived, pending deletion. She traced the edge of the shelf, once packed with thick folders and annotated budgets. All gone. On a nearby desk sat a simple plastic container of office supplies. She reached in, searching. Her favorite fountain pen, black lacquer with a gold clip, was gone. In its place, a bulk pack of purple felt-tip markers. She stood there a long time. No one had been cruel. No one had raised a voice. But the message was clear. Not a single hand had stopped her, yet everything had been taken. She walked back to the hallway, pausing by a window overlooking the city. The skyline looked just as it had the day they opened their first office. She remembered standing beside James, their fingers intertwined, the future vast and golden before them. Today, she stood alone. The building hadn't changed. Only she had disappeared. Chelsea texted me, "Family dinner tonight." But it wasn't for me. The text had arrived while Eleanor was slicing apples. Crisp, fragrant, just the way James liked them. She had planned to bake her usual Thanksgiving pie a Harper tradition, even when the children were small and money was tight. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, reading the message again. Family dinner tonight. Nothing more. No address, no time, no warmth. It wasn't an invitation. It was an announcement. She placed the phone down slowly next to the peeled apples. The bowl of cinnamon and nutmeg sat untouched. Outside, the sky had already gone dark, the city glowing in cold specks of light. Eleanor's apartment was quiet, too quiet for Thanksgiving. Once this kitchen would have been filled with voices, spills, laughter. She had hosted every Harper Thanksgiving for 37 years. Even after James passed, the children came. Until now. She turned on the oven, then turned it off. The apples would keep. The group chat buzzed on her phone. She opened it, photos rolling in. Ethan holding a wine glass. Chelsea in a golden blouse, seated at the head of a long table. Roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce. The whole tableau lit warmly under pendant lights. She recognized the apartment. It used to be theirs. Hers and James's, before Chelsea insisted they modernize the space and take over. Now it had new curtains, new walls, and no trace of her. The phone rang. Her granddaughter's face appeared 7 years old still, with those wide, curious eyes. "Grandma, are you coming?" Eleanor smiled, surprised. "No one told me where it is, darling." The girl looked off-screen. "But you always come." A voice in the background called her name. "Gotta go," the girl chirped, and the call ended. Eleanor stood for a moment staring at the darkened screen. She boiled water. The old kettle whistled weakly. From the cupboard she took the cracked white teacup. She had meant to throw it out twice, but somehow it stayed. She set one place at the table. No candle, no centerpiece. Just her, a slice of bread, and the tea. She didn't feel hungry. Halfway through lifting the cup, the phone pinged again. She almost ignored it. But then curiosity. A photo sent by Chelsea. The Harper family table. Toasts mid-air. Smiles frozen in joy. The caption read, "Successful Harper family night." Eleanor put the phone face down. She took a breath. Not shallow, not trembling, just steady. She picked up her fork, cut the bread. Bitterness came not from the tea, but from the silence that had crept in and made itself at home. She remembered the first Thanksgiving after James died. Ethan had stood in her kitchen carving the turkey with a clumsy pride. Chelsea had burned the gravy. The kids had spilled juice all over the floor. It had been chaos and hers. Now the chaos belonged to someone else, and no one even thought to bring leftovers. I was once the host of these dinners. Now I don't even get leftovers. The crack on the cup had grown just like the silence between us. Morning light seeped through the frosted window, casting a soft glow on Eleanor's kitchen. The teacup sat where it always did, on the right side of the stove next to the kettle. She hadn't used it last night. The image from Chelsea's message still lingered like a bitter aftertaste. She lifted the cup now slowly and turned it in her hand. The crack had deepened, slicing further along the curve beneath the handle. It wasn't just cosmetic anymore. It threatened the cup's entire balance. Her thumb traced the fault line. "I should throw you out," she murmured. But she didn't. Instead, she placed it on the table and walked to her old file drawer. Papers rustled under her fingers, some brittle with age, others neatly tabbed. Minutes from board meetings, correspondence, contracts. She pulled out a leather-bound folder labeled Founding Documents, Harper Row. The first few pages were intact. Her handwriting looped carefully in the margins. But when she flipped to the section on governance and succession, something felt wrong. There was no formal record of her being removed, No board vote, no resignation filed under her name. She sat back, heart ticking a little faster. The phone rang. Henry. She hadn't spoken to him in almost a year. James's old colleague. Her lawyer once, and perhaps still a friend. Eleanor came his warm voice. I meant to call yesterday. Happy Thanksgiving, albeit a day late. She smiled genuinely. Thank you, Henry. It was quiet. I imagine it was, he said gently. I heard some murmurs. Are you all right? I'm not sure she admitted. They said I was being retired. But there's nothing in writing. No meeting minutes. Nothing official. Henry paused. That's not right. That's what I thought. It could be a mistake. Or, he hesitated. Someone could have made a deliberate effort to erase you. Quietly. A shiver ran through her. Do you want me to look into it? He asked. Not yet, she replied. Let me check a few things first. Later that day, Eleanor called the company's archive department. A brisk voice answered. I'm sorry, Mrs. Harper, but access to internal records is restricted to current board members. I founded this company. I understand, ma'am. But access protocols have changed. Click. She sat at her kitchen table long after the call ended. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the floor. The cup still sat in front of her, the crack now catching the light like a wound. That evening, as she boiled water for tea again, her laptop pinged. New mail. Sender E. Subject. You should see this before it's too late. One attachment. Her breath caught. She hesitated, but only for a second. Click. A scanned document opened. The header read, Internal Strategy Session, Confidential Draft. Her eyes narrowed as she read, Discussion of Future Leadership Optics. Recommendation remove non-active founders from public-facing roles. Signed, Chelsea R. Harper. And beneath that, we must prepare for a transition in brand image. The legacy must evolve. But it was the timestamp that stopped her heart cold. 3 months ago, long before the official restructuring, long before any meeting, and the timestamp was from 3 months ago. I found my original business plan in the office shredder bin. The elevator doors opened with a tired sigh, releasing Eleanor into the fluorescent chill of the archives floor. It was the one place in Harper Row where time still clung to the walls, where the digital age hadn't quite erased paper trails and forgotten decisions. Her heels clicked softly against the linoleum as she made her way past rows of silent filing cabinets. No one looked up. No one asked why she was there. She held her handbag tightly, the tremor in her fingers, now less about age, more about purpose. There was one thing she had come for, the original strategic plan from 1991. The one she had written by hand, then transcribed and saved onto the company's earliest hard drives. Back when the vision for Harper Row had included not only profit, but responsibility toward the community, the employees, and the causes they believed in. At the far end of the corridor, the storage room door was locked. But then, footsteps. Emily. The young assistant looked startled to see her, then glanced over her shoulder before approaching. I'm not supposed to, she whispered. Eleanor didn't plead. She simply looked her in the eyes. After a pause, Emily reached into her pocket, pulled out her keycard and tapped the lock. The door opened with a low click. 10 minutes, Emily said quietly, and I didn't see you. Eleanor gave a small nod. No words. Inside the room was colder. A single desk lamp buzzed faintly in the corner. She moved with practiced steps to the section labeled Strategic Planning Archives. Most of the folders were new, slick, color-coded, printed with branding slogans. She dug deeper. Behind a metal divider, she found the box. 1990, 1995. Founders' documents. Her fingers closed around a thick black folder. Inside, she recognized her own handwriting, bold, looping strokes. A vision statement, financial projections, community engagement pledges. But something was missing. The last section was torn. She looked around. There by the shredder, a bin marked "to dispose." On top of the heap, her original copy. Slightly creased with a coffee stain on the corner. She reached in and pulled it out carefully, pages still intact. Back at home that evening, Eleanor laid the original plan beside the latest company presentation, the one Chelsea had unveiled at the quarterly meeting. Slide after slide of sleek branding, global expansion targets, influencer partnerships. But none of it reflected the old values. The final pages, where her plan had outlined profit sharing for employees, reinvestment in local education, and ethical sourcing practices, were nowhere to be found. Gone. Cut out. They didn't just erase me. They erased what I built it for. There's a letter I never mailed. And maybe I should have. The house was still. Only the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway broke the silence, each sound echoing like a soft knock on memory's door. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, a small wooden box on her lap. She hadn't opened it in years. Its hinges creaked as she lifted the lid, revealing a stack of yellowed envelopes, tied with a pale blue ribbon. One of them bore a name in delicate handwriting. Sister Clara, St. Brigid's Orphanage. Her fingers trembled as she untied the ribbon and pulled the letter free. April 3rd, 1995. Dearest Eleanor, thank you doesn't feel like enough. Because of your generosity, 20 of our children now have full scholarships, warm coats, and meals every day. You've given us hope. You've given them a future. We pray for you each evening. May the work you do flourish with the same grace you've shown us. With love. Sister Clara. Eleanor's eyes lingered on the final line, smudged faintly, as if by a tear long dried. She remembered that day. The sun had been merciless over the cracked pavement as she stepped out of the car in her pressed navy suit briefcase still in hand. But when the small girl ran to her barefoot with tangled hair and eyes full of fear, nothing else mattered. I can't take you home, Eleanor had whispered, kneeling to meet the girl's eyes. But I will build something, so that children like you won't go hungry again. And she had. That year, the company turned its first profit. She hadn't bought a new car. She hadn't taken a bonus. She'd sent the entire dividend to Sister Clara's orphanage instead. She held the letter now close to her chest. Had Chelsea ever seen this? Had she known what Harper Row had stood for at the beginning? Or had she seen only the buildings, the numbers, the brand? Outside wind brushed against the windows. Inside, Eleanor's resolve gathered like quiet rain. She walked slowly to her desk, sat down, and pulled a fresh envelope from the drawer. She slid the old letter inside, added a short note in her own hand. For the record, and for those who've forgotten why we began. She sealed it. Tomorrow she would mail it to Sister Clara's successor if she could find one. Maybe to the company's archives. Maybe to the press. She didn't know yet. But it would not stay hidden any longer, because this wasn't just about her name. It's not just my name they erased. It's the why. You once saved me, Eleanor. Maybe it's time I return the favor. The bell above the door chimed softly as Eleanor stepped into the cafe. It was the kind of place tucked between bookstores and forgotten pharmacies, its warmth almost reluctant but real. The windows were fogged, blurring the bustle of the city beyond. She spotted Henry near the back, his coat folded neatly beside him, 2 cups already on the table. He stood when he saw her. Eleanor? Henry. She smiled faintly and sat down, placing her old ceramic teacup carefully on the table. You brought your own? He asked, half smiling. She nodded. It tastes different in this one. Henry glanced at the cup, but didn't comment. Instead, he slid a manila folder across the table. You mailed a letter, he said. That was brave, or foolish. Maybe both. Eleanor didn't smile. It felt overdue. Henry opened the folder, revealing a printout of the original business charter from 1991. I remember this, he said. The first time I read it, I thought it was idealistic. But you made most of it real. Eleanor sipped her tea. You once called it naive. I did, and I was wrong. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet filled with clinks of cups and the low hum of jazz. A young waitress passed by, slowing ever so slightly as she refilled Henry's water. Her eyes lingered on Eleanor's face a moment too long before retreating. Henry leaned in. You know, he said, voice lower now, you paid my first year of law school. I never asked why you did it. You were a bright intern with a sick mother, Eleanor replied simply. It wasn't charity. It was belief. He exhaled. I've carried that ever since. Never said thank you properly. Well, she said, eyes meeting his, maybe you can now. She pulled another folder from her bag, the one she'd taken from the archives. Her fingers brushed the edge of the shredded document as she passed it to him. He scanned it quickly. Chelsea's signature. Pre-approval of a founder agreement that was never voided. Does it still carry legal weight? Eleanor asked. Depends, he said, tapping the paper. If we can prove intent to erase you without proper notice with this document still in effect, then yes, you could file for wrongful removal. And maybe more. Eleanor didn't speak. Her tea had gone lukewarm. She didn't mind. Henry reached into his satchel and pulled out another sheet of paper, one she hadn't seen in years. It was the original will-like agreement between the three original board members herself, her late husband, and Chelsea. Her name was highlighted in bold, underlined. She signed this, Eleanor, years ago, never revoked it. She forgot one thing. He placed it gently in front of her. Chelsea forgot one thing. I keep everything. They forgot the camera was always on. The hallway outside the storage room echoed with emptiness. It was late on a Friday, and the office had already exhaled its last breath of the work week. Fluorescent lights flickered faintly above as Eleanor approached the door, her steps quiet, deliberate. Emily was waiting, hands buried deep in the pockets of her oversized coat. Her face was pale, eyes darting toward the hallway as if the walls themselves might betray her. I shouldn't be doing this, she whispered. Then don't, Eleanor replied gently. No one's asking you to risk anything. Emily shook her head and pulled a small USB drive from her pocket. I can't hold on to this anymore. Eleanor took it, the cool plastic pressing into her palm like a loaded weight. I found it while auditing security logs, Emily said. They forgot the backup server still stores old camera feeds even after system resets. Eleanor looked at her. What am I about to see? Emily hesitated, her lips tightening. It's a closed-door conversation. Chelsea and Marcus, a week before the restructuring. The storage room was dimly lit, and Eleanor sat near the lone desk in the corner as she plugged the USB into her personal laptop. Emily stood behind her arms, crossed tightly, as if bracing against a storm. The video flickered to life. Chelsea sat at the end of a long meeting table, her heels propped on a chair. She leaned back, wineglass in hand, while Marcus hovered just behind her, arms folded. We clean house, Chelsea said, casually swirling the liquid. She won't fight. Eleanor's too old. Eleanor's face didn't flinch, but her fingers wrapped around her old ceramic teacup tensed slightly. Marcus's voice came through faintly. You're sure the documents won't come back? We've controlled the narrative, Chelsea replied. If she asks questions, we'll throw her a charity title. Something harmless. Old founders love that. The laughter that followed was quiet, cruel. Eleanor clicked pause. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Eleanor turned her voice low. I won't let you ruin yourself for me. Emily's eyes glistened, but she shook her head. I'm not doing it for you. Eleanor tilted her head. I'm doing it for what this place used to be, before all this. In the corner of the paused video, Marcus remained still watching Chelsea, silent but present. Eleanor closed the laptop. They underestimated you, Emily murmured. Eleanor stood. Her face was calm, but her posture had shifted no longer, weary, no longer invisible. She placed the USB back in its case, tucked it into her bag, and looked out at the empty office through the narrow window of the storage room. And that, Chelsea, she said softly, was your biggest mistake. Some truths don't need shouting. They echo. The wind had been hammering the windows all evening, hurling itself against the apartment with a winter fury that whistled through the narrow gaps. Eleanor sat curled in her living room chair, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, the same one she had worn on her first day at Harper Row. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood and old books, warm, settled, and untouched, much like her own presence in recent months. She turned off the muted television. It had just aired a segment about women over 60 being quietly removed from executive boards, replaced under the guise of progress. Her reflection in the darkened screen stared back, quiet-lined, but still firm. Her eyes fell on a framed photograph resting on the corner shelf. A team of 10 stood outside a brick building, smiles, wide eyes bright. She was at the center, younger by decades, in a navy coat and leather gloves. Ethan, barely 10, had been the one to take the picture, standing on his tiptoes to reach the shutter. Eleanor rose and walked over to the shelf, lifting the frame gently. The image pulled her back, 1992. Late afternoon. Ethan sat cross-legged on the office carpet, watching her write on the whiteboard. You always draw trees, Mum, he had said. They're roots, she replied, crouching beside him. You build from them. Even when you can't see them anymore, they hold you up. Will people forget they're there? He asked. She had smiled, brushing his hair back. Not if you remind them. In the present, Eleanor returned to her seat, the photo still in hand. The silence in the apartment deepened. No messages, no knocks, no visitors. Just the groaning of the wind and the soft tick of the antique wall clock behind her. Her fingers hovered over the small audio recorder she kept for old memos half forgotten under a stack of recipe books. She clicked it on. A soft red light blinked to life. She cleared her throat. November 25th. The night wind is wild tonight. A pause. If my granddaughter ever asks who I was, I don't want her to read it off a plaque, or not find it at all. I want her to hear it, in my voice. She spoke slowly, not rehearsing, just remembering. About the first chairs they bought, about the arguments over ethical investment, about the afternoons she stayed behind to clean the floors herself, so the interns wouldn't have to. I wasn't erased overnight, she said. They started by not asking me to lunch. She chuckled faintly, then fell silent for a moment. There's still more to do, she added. But tonight I just needed to speak. She clicked the recorder off. The wind outside had quieted slightly, as if pausing to listen. She placed the recorder on the table beside her teacup, the one with the thin crack that had begun to lengthen down the side, a fault line only she seemed to notice. She reached out and ran her thumb across it gently, as if acknowledging something unsaid. Then she sat back, folded her hands over her lap, and looked out into the darkness where no boardrooms waited, no emails arrived, and no voices called her name. "I may be fading from the company," she whispered aloud, "but my voice is getting clearer. It wasn't the absence of my name on the guest list. It was the silence when I arrived. The soft notes of jazz drifted through the air, weaving between crystal glasses and low, practiced laughter. The grand ballroom of the Westmore Hotel glittered under its chandeliers, each reflection bouncing off polished shoes and sequined dresses. Servers glided between clusters of guests with trays of hors d'oeuvres and champagne, while a large golden banner fluttered gently above the main stage, Harper Row, celebrating 40 years of innovation. Eleanor Harper stood at the entrance, pausing for a beat before stepping in. She wore a simple slate-grey dress, tailored but without flourish. No jewels, no brooches. Just the quiet dignity of a woman who had nothing left to prove. Heads turned. Not immediately, but in waves like a ripple of uncertainty. Someone whispered a fork, froze mid-air, a wine glass trembled slightly in its holder. Yet no one approached. Chelsea spotted her first. Her smile was immediate, tight practiced. "Oh, Eleanor," she said, crossing the floor with perfect posture and a flute of champagne. "I didn't think you'd feel up to it tonight." "I was curious," Eleanor replied, glancing at the crowd. 40 years. It's quite something." "Yes, we've come a long way," Chelsea said. Her eyes flickered to the event planner across the room, then back. "I hope you'll enjoy the evening. As a guest, of course." Eleanor gave a slow nod. "Of course." She moved through the room like a shadow, calm, deliberate. Some turned away quickly, pretending not to see her. Others offered brief nods, then returned to their conversations. A few of the newer staff stared, unsure whether to greet her or ask for her plate. She stopped at a tall table near the bar. A young employee looked up and offered a half smile, then glanced nervously toward the center of the room. Eleanor simply nodded and walked on. At the far side, a familiar voice called Mom Ethan stood drink in hand, dressed in a dark blue suit that fit too tightly around his shoulders. He looked older than his years, or perhaps simply worn. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, trying to smile. "I wasn't sure either." Before more could pass between them, Chelsea appeared, hand on Ethan's arm. "We were just talking about the keynote," she said smoothly. "Ethan's presenting with Marcus tonight." Eleanor turned to her son. "That's nice. You always had a strong voice." Ethan opened his mouth, perhaps to speak, perhaps to apologize, but no words came. Then Marcus appeared beside them. Tall, lean silver at the temples. He extended a hand. "Eleanor, it's good to see you. You too, Marcus. I was just telling someone our co-founder always knew how to command a room." Chelsea stiffened. Former honorary advisor, she corrected her voice, still sweet but brittle at the edges. "It's important we update our titles." Eleanor smiled. Not broadly, just enough. "I suppose titles do change." She sipped her club soda no wine tonight and turned to gaze at the stage where photos of the company's early days rotated on a digital screen. In one, a young Eleanor stood beside a warehouse with her sleeves rolled up, a clipboard in hand. The caption read, "Team Spirit, 1984. Her name was nowhere to be found, but her face was right there. I didn't raise my voice, but the room got quieter anyway. She watches everything. That's why she never talks." The hallway light buzzed faintly as Eleanor stepped out of the elevator and made her way toward her apartment. Her heels clicked softly against the worn tile floor. The cold had crept into the walls of the building, making the air brittle and sharp. From across the hall, a dim orange glow flickered behind an old lace curtain. Mrs. Doyle's window. She had lived in the apartment directly across for over 2 decades. A woman of routines and rhythms, tea at 6, knitting by 7, light out by 9. She rarely spoke more than a greeting, but her presence had always been constant, as though the building itself leaned on her. As Eleanor approached her own door, she noticed the envelope sticking out of her mailbox. No address, no name. Inside was a folded note written in tidy cursive. "You're not crazy. I saw what they did." Her breath caught. The paper trembled in her fingers. She glanced toward the window. Mrs. Doyle sat in her usual spot, a ball of deep green yarn in her lap needles moving steadily. Her eyes, however, were not on the scarf. They were on Eleanor. An hour later, Eleanor stood outside the old woman's door. She raised her hand to knock, but hesitated. Before her knuckles touched the wood, the door opened. "You better come in," Mrs. Doyle said, her voice low but clear. The apartment was warm, filled with the faint scent of cinnamon and old books. Knitted blankets lay folded on every surface, and a single lamp cast a golden hue across the room. Mrs. Doyle poured tea without asking, and handed Eleanor a cup. Her hands were wrinkled, the knuckles slightly swollen but steady. "I've seen you pacing more these days," she said. "Didn't think you'd knock, though." Eleanor gave a thin smile. "You left the note." Mrs. Doyle nodded once. "I don't sleep well. Never have. This window's been my television for 20 years. She sipped her tea, eyes steady. "I saw your son, last spring. He left your apartment late at night, arms full of folders. Didn't say goodbye." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the cup. "And your daughter-in-law—" Mrs. Doyle continued. "She came by often. Left angry more than once." There was a pause. The knitting needles clicked gently beside them. "You could have told me sooner," Eleanor said. "I don't talk unless it matters," Doyle replied. "Tonight, it matters." She reached beneath the side table and pulled out an old, scratched camera. "I take pictures. Out the window. Mostly birds and seasons. But sometimes people. This one still works. It's not much, but there's timestamps, faces. Maybe that's enough for someone like you." Eleanor took the camera gently. It was heavier than it looked, worn smooth at the edges from years of use. She looked at the woman across from her. No pity in those eyes, just a sharpness, a quiet clarity. "Why help me now?" she asked. Mrs. Doyle shrugged. "Some women deserve to be remembered. Some men deserve not to be." A faint smile tugged at the corners of Eleanor's mouth. She stood, nodded in thanks, and stepped back into the hallway, camera in hand. Across the hall, Mrs. Doyle resumed her knitting gaze, already drifting toward the window once more. She didn't say much, but her silence held evidence. Everyone else had new nameplates. Mine was scratched, but still there. Rain tapped softly against the narrow hallway window as Eleanor stepped out of her apartment. The floor creaked beneath her slippers. The dim light above flickered, once then held steady. At the far end of the corridor stood the old bank of mailboxes, faded metal, tarnished locks, and a row of nameplates slowly being replaced over the years. She walked toward them, umbrella tucked beneath her arm. Morning deliveries had already come. Flyers spilled slightly from the overstuffed boxes belonging to newer tenants. Hers box 4B was nearly empty. The nameplate E. Harper was scratched. The paint chipped around the letters dulled from decades of touch and time. But it was still there. Eleanor opened the box. Among the usual circulars and noise was a single envelope, no stamp, no return address. She turned it over carefully and opened it. Inside was a photocopy of an old newspaper clipping dated May 1982. "Meet the woman who changed business ethics." Her own face stared back at her younger but unmistakable standing in front of the original Harper Row warehouse in a denim jacket, hand on her hip, eyes firm with purpose. A soft voice startled her. "Are you the lady in the picture?" Eleanor looked down. A girl no more than 7 stood beside her small rain boots, squeaking on the tiles. She held a pink umbrella shaped like a cat and blinked up with serious eyes. I think so," Eleanor said, surprised by how quiet her own voice sounded. "You look the same," the girl said simply, then ran off down the hall as a door opened and someone called her name. Eleanor remained frozen for a moment, fingers brushing the edges of the article. The hallway around her hadn't changed in years, the smell of damp concrete, the sound of distant plumbing, the way winter light settled like dust. Yet something shifted inside her. That photo. That question. They had taken her name down at Harper Row. They had removed her title, rewritten documents, locked away files. She had been cast out of boardrooms, erased from anniversary speeches, and ignored at company events. But here, outside her apartment, in a rain-worn hallway with peeling paint, her name still existed. On an old metal plate, in the eyes of a child, in a headline from 4 decades ago. Not for profits, not for positions, but because what she built had meant something. She leaned slightly closer to the nameplate, touched it gently. Her reflection flickered faintly in the scratched surface. She folded the article, slipped it into the envelope, and tucked it into her coat. For once, she didn't feel like hiding it. They erased my name from the boardroom. But not from her question. The email wasn't meant for me, but it changed everything. The morning light slanted through Eleanor's kitchen window, falling in muted streaks across the table where her old laptop lay open. A thin layer of dust had gathered on its surface since the last time she dared turn it on. Henry had managed to help her reset the password the night before. It had taken a few tries, and a long string of security questions neither of them could answer without laughing, but the inbox was finally open. Most of the emails were junk. Forgotten newsletters, auto-reminders, solicitations from retirement planners. But one subject line stood out like a cracked tile in a perfect floor RE strategic phase-out timeline. Internal only. She almost didn't click it. Almost. But curiosity had a way of prying even the most reluctant doors. The message was brief, sent from Marcus, addressed to Chelsea. Only somehow it had landed in Eleanor's inbox too. Attached a confidential PDF. She opened it with a single breath. Inside was the final version of the Harper Row restructuring blueprint. Not the sanitized one released to the public, but the raw plan the version meant only for the inner circle. Halfway through, she stopped reading. There on page 7 was a bullet point under Executive Image Risk Management Phase, OUT, EH, due to advanced age, unpredictable public image, and association with outdated ethical positions. No press acknowledgement. Avoid appearances with family. The words sat heavy on the screen like ash that hadn't cooled. She picked up the phone. Henry answered on the second ring. "Did you get in?" "I did," Eleanor said quietly. "And someone made a mistake." She forwarded him the email. Silence stretched between them as he read. This is actionable," he said finally. "We could build a case on this alone. Age discrimination. Deliberate erasure." "Yes," Eleanor replied, her voice even. "But I don't want a lawsuit." Henry paused. "Then what do you want?" Eleanor looked out the window. The city was just beginning to wake, buses wheezing down damp streets, lights flickering in office towers. Somewhere in that maze, Chelsea sat in a chair that once belonged to her. Somewhere Marcus was likely sipping coffee, unaware he had just pulled a thread from his own tailored illusion. I don't want to burn the house, Eleanor said. I'll open the windows. Let the world see inside. She closed the laptop slowly. I want them to say it out loud, she added. To own it, in their own words. Henry exhaled a low whistle. That's riskier. Eleanor smiled faintly. No, that's justice. They'll come after you, he said. They already have. Outside, the wind picked up. A leaf slapped against the glass, once then fell away. Inside, Eleanor stood still, not shaken, not bitter. Just ready. I won't burn the house. I'll open the windows and let the world see inside. The note had no name. But I knew exactly who wrote it. It was raining again, thin, persistent, and grey as regret. Eleanor's coat was damp at the shoulders when she stepped into the Harper Row lobby. She hadn't planned to come, but something instinct maybe had nudged her feet toward this place. The lobby was quiet. Employees shuffled by with coffees and tired expressions. No one stopped her. No one looked too long. The security desk stood where it always had beneath the glass staircase that spiraled up to what used to be her office. A young man with headphones glanced up, then nodded respectfully. She thought he wouldn't say anything. But just as she passed, he slid a folded piece of paper toward her across the counter. No words, no expression, just the paper. Eleanor took it, heart beating faster than she expected. She waited until she reached the corner of the corridor before unfolding it. It was a simple note, slanted handwriting, no name. Check the backup server. Backup. I didn't delete anything. She didn't need a signature. That evening, Henry helped her access the backup system from his office. It took less than 10 minutes. The password hadn't been changed. What they found was everything. Years of internal correspondence, notes between board members, drafts of strategy decks. But buried among them were the real fragments, the pieces that once made Harper Row more than a company. Emails from Chelsea, back when she was just beginning to climb the ladder. Eleanor is our heartbeat. We should never forget that. And one message dated just 3 months before Eleanor's removal from Emily. Thank you for showing me that leadership doesn't have to mean loudness. You made me believe in this place. Eleanor read it in silence. Then another folder untitled, almost hidden, inside a lone text file. It contained a single sentence. You're still my founder. Eleanor leaned back in the chair. Rain tapped softly on the office window. She didn't need to know who had left the note. The hand that wrote those words, tentative, lightly shaking, had done more than offer support. It had remembered. She closed the laptop. Her eyes burned, not from grief or fury, but from the strange warmth of being seen after so long. She thought of the younger employees, those who had joined long after she'd built the foundation. People like Emily caught between silence and truth. In the end, what mattered wasn't allegiance. It was memory. I didn't need to know who wrote it. I needed to know someone still remembered. They asked Chelsea to speak, but I was the one who wrote that speech 40 years ago. The marble steps of City Hall glistened with early frost as Eleanor climbed them, her cane tapping softly against the stone. She hadn't been invited. She didn't need to be. This building, this ceremony, it had her fingerprints on it long before her name had vanished from plaques and programs. Inside the hall, buzzed with guests and floral arrangements. Strings played something gentle in the background. Cameras blinked in silence. A banner draped across the stage read, Harper and Row, 40 years of community impact. Eleanor found a seat in the back row. She didn't expect anyone to notice. That wasn't the point. Chelsea stood by the podium, polished and poised in navy silk. Her voice was smooth measured, too perfect. It is my honor to continue the legacy of this great company which has always believed in doing good, not just doing well. Ethan stepped up to introduce the keynote. His voice was steady. His hair too neatly combed his mother's hair, once tousled that same way after long nights drafting visions of a better business world. He began reading. And Eleanor froze. Word for word, line for line, it was hers. The opening she'd written in 1984 for the first community pledge. The sentence structure. The rhythm. Even the turn of phrase about lifting from the root, not trimming the leaves. She watched his mouth move her own breath shallow. When he reached the final line, because business at its best is a hand extended, not a ladder climbed, Eleanor stood. There was no dramatic music, no gasp from the crowd, just the soft hush of a room registering an interruption. She didn't rush. She walked up the aisle past rows of unfamiliar faces toward a son who couldn't meet her eyes and a woman who had used her words like borrowed perfume. Eleanor reached the foot of the stage, turned to the crowd, and spoke calm, even unshaking. I remember writing those words. I just didn't imagine hearing them. From someone else's mouth. Silence. Chelsea's smile tightened, but didn't fade. Ethan blinked the paper, trembling slightly in his hands. And then, from the back corner, 3 rows behind, where Eleanor had sat a single clap. Then another, and another. Not loud, not thunderous, but undeniable. Henry was among them, quietly filming his phone held low. Eleanor didn't bow, didn't linger. She stepped back, returned to her seat as the ceremony resumed. But nothing felt the same. She hadn't accused anyone. She hadn't raised her voice. She didn't have to. It wasn't applause. It was acknowledgement. Before they rewrote the bylaws, I made sure the originals were still in my drawer. The lamp in Henry's office cast a soft glow over stacks of yellowed paper and legal folders. Outside, the city murmured under a thin veil of winter rain, but inside everything was quiet, preparation, not panic. Eleanor sat across from him, her hands steady despite the storm she'd been living through. From her leather bag, she pulled out a worn folder, edges softened with age. She opened it carefully and placed the document in front of Henry. Meeting minutes from June 14th, 1991, she said. Signed by myself, Ethan, and the original board. Henry adjusted his glasses and scanned the page. Article 3. Founding members retain lifetime voting rights unless revoked by full board consensus. He looked up. This clause was never rescinded. No, Eleanor said. But it was never mentioned again, either. Henry nodded slowly. Then the new bylaws Chelsea filed last year, if she didn't have unanimous signatures, would be invalid, at least legally questionable. Eleanor leaned back in the chair, her voice firm. I didn't speak up then. But silence doesn't equal surrender. Henry tapped his pen against the edge of the folder. This is enough to file a formal request for rehearing. No lawsuits, no press, just due process. As he spoke, his computer pinged. A new message. From Marcus Reynolds, subject RE founding clause. I didn't know she kept this. We need to talk. Henry turned the screen to Eleanor. She read the line, then looked back at Henry. No more talks, she said. Just truth. Henry smiled slightly respectfully. I'll draft the letter tonight. We'll send it to the board by morning. Together, they laid out the documents across the desk evidence, not just of rights, but of memory. Photos of the early days. Letters from clients dated decades ago. The original company charter typed on a manual machine with ink that had started to fade but never disappeared. I used to think these papers were sentimental, Eleanor murmured. Now I know they're anchors. You can't drift from what's still attached. As she prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Henry, she said softly, thank you for remembering who I was before they tried to tell you who I wasn't. He didn't reply with words, just a nod, deep and knowing. Later that night, Eleanor stood by her apartment window, the city flickering below. She could feel the shift, not dramatic, not cinematic, but real. She wasn't fighting for control. She was demanding recognition. And in the end, that was stronger. It won't be a battle. It'll be a reading. Of everything they tried to erase. Glass walls don't hide shame. They display it. The morning light poured into the top-floor conference room, casting long shadows across the polished table. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city, but more than that, they offered the rest of the office a silent glimpse inside. No sound would carry out. Only images, posture, expression, truth exposed without narration. Eleanor entered with slow, unwavering steps. She wore grey again, the same shade she had worn to the anniversary party, but this time not to stand apart. This time she stood for what remained. Henry followed, briefcase in hand, nodding respectfully at the 4 board members seated at the far end. Chelsea already sat at the table's head, stiff-backed, lips tight. Ethan was there too, eyes cast downward, fingers fidgeting under the table. Marcus arrived last, no laptop, no files, only a single sheet of paper folded in half. Eleanor placed her materials gently on the table, a folder of original meeting minutes from 1991, the founding charter, a printed transcript of the recorded conversation between Chelsea and Marcus, and a copy of the mistakenly sent email detailing her removal for branding purposes. She didn't speak first. Henry did. "This is not a legal proceeding," he said, voice calm. "This is a reading of things that were nearly erased." Chelsea scoffed lightly. "She's not on the board anymore." Henry didn't blink. She never legally left. "And this," he tapped the 1991 document, "is her signature. Yours, Ethan's, all affirming lifetime voting rights." Silence. Eleanor then slid forward the folder of documents. Her hands didn't shake. "This company," she said finally, "was founded on 3 things: memory, responsibility, and the promise that no voice should be erased just because it's quieter." The room remained still, except Marcus. He stood up. He walked slowly to Chelsea, unfolded the paper in his hand, and placed it in front of her. His eyes didn't leave hers. "This is the email I sent, that she received by mistake. That shouldn't have existed in the first place." Chelsea's jaw tightened. She didn't speak. She didn't look at Eleanor. The board exchanged glances. Then one of them cleared his throat. "We'll take a vote." It didn't take long. 4 hands raised, no hesitation. "We move to reinstate Ms. Eleanor Harper as honorary founding chair and grant her permanent advisory access to all executive decisions." No one said the word sorry, but no one met her eyes. Eleanor gathered her papers slowly, with the grace of someone who never needed to win, only to be seen. As she stood, she turned briefly toward the glass, toward the dozens of employees who watched from the other side of the wall. They saw her, not as a relic, but as a founder. They didn't say sorry, but they couldn't meet my eyes. He left the room last, but he didn't turn around. The hallway stretched long and white, washed in the artificial brightness of overhead fluorescence. It was quiet, not the dignified silence of a library, but the raw, unfinished stillness that followed something once buried and now unearthed. Eleanor stood against the cool wall, her coat draped over one arm, her breath even. She wasn't tired, just still. Inside her, the noise had finally quieted. No racing thoughts, no trembling hands. Just the echo of truth and a waiting space where something else used to live. The glass doors to the conference room clicked open. Ethan stepped out last to leave. His steps were slow measured. When he reached her, he stopped. They stood close enough to hear each other breathe, but not close enough to touch. Eleanor looked at him, not expectantly, just openly. "You don't have to say anything," she said, her voice soft. I already heard what mattered. Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor, then to the phone in his hand. He didn't speak. His thumb hovered over the screen. Eleanor noticed the email title flash briefly across the glass. "I'm sorry, Mom." He hesitated. Then, without a word, he tapped the trash icon. Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply nodded once more to herself, then to him. He walked away. His shoes made no sound on the polished tile. He didn't look back. A janitor, a man easily in his 70s, passed with a mop cart and paused. He glanced at Eleanor, then gave her a brief, respectful nod. He didn't need to know the details. Some stories hang in the air like perfume strong enough to sense without words. She nodded back. Ethan reached the elevator. It opened. He stepped inside. The doors closed with a soft, mechanical sigh. Eleanor remained where she was staring, not at the elevator, but at the wall opposite blank sterile once lined with corporate slogans. She touched the place where her name had once hung. Her fingers didn't linger. There was no victory here, just clarity. He left silence behind, but I wasn't empty anymore. The letters stayed in the drawer, but I always knew which one I never sent. The rain tapped against the window like an old habit trying to be remembered. Eleanor sat at her writing desk, wrapped in a grey cardigan, a teacup cooling beside her untouched. The room was lit by a single lamp, its light warm, but worn the kind that softened edges rather than sharpened them. She opened the bottom drawer. Inside, envelopes yellowed with time, their corners curled slightly paper-soft from years of silence. Letters she'd written but never mailed. Some were addressed, some weren't. She pulled out the one marked "To Ethan, age 15", another to Chelsea, before the merger, and another to M. Each letter was a breath held too long. She unfolded the one to Ethan. The ink had bled a little, but the words were still legible. "When you asked me, 'When do people become old, Mom?' I said, 'When they stop being heard.' I was wrong. We become old when we start believing we're no longer allowed to speak." She smiled faintly. He was 10 when he asked that. They had been at the park. He had just tripped over a root and called himself too old for swings. She had laughed then. Now the echo of that laughter felt like someone else's memory. She read the letter to Chelsea. It had been written in her younger daughter-in-law's first year at Harper Row. "You remind me of myself, Chelsea Sharp, proud too quick to assume the room belongs to you." It does, but only if you remember why you walked in. Then came the envelope with no name. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. She wrote, "Dear me." Her pen moved slowly as if carving more than writing. Not to record history, not to justify, just to remember. You weren't perfect. You lost your temper. You stayed quiet when you should have screamed. But you also showed up when it mattered. You let go before bitterness turned to rot. And when they pushed you out, you didn't disappear. You waited. You watched. And you stayed kind. That matters. She didn't cry, but her breath caught as she signed the letter, not with her full name, just the simple E. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into a plain envelope. No stamp, no address. She placed it in the drawer, right where the others lived, but not like them. She didn't intend to send it. It wasn't written for a recipient. It was written for someone who had been fading, someone she refused to let go. I wrote it for the person I refused to forget. Myself. They replaced the plaque. That's fine. I replaced the need to see it. Spring had returned gently, as if the world had remembered softness again. The old apple tree in the park had begun to bloom small white blossoms, clinging to its branches like fragile truths. Eleanor sat on the wooden bench beneath it, her coat draped over her shoulders, her hands folded over a cloth tote bag. Beside her, a young girl sat cross-legged with a book far too large for her lap. The pages ruffled in the breeze, but she held them down with the determination only children have when they're fully absorbed. Eleanor watched her for a moment, then leaned slightly. "You're reading the end first?" she asked with a half-smile. The girl nodded without looking up. "I like to know it ends okay, so I don't get too sad in the middle." Eleanor chuckled quietly, fully. "That's wise." The air smelled of wet bark and something almost sweet. Far in the distance, a jogger passed, followed by a couple walking a dog that was far more interested in squirrels than its leash. A woman approached mid-40s, composed, holding a coffee in one hand and a tote bag in the other. She smiled warmly at Eleanor before turning to the girl. "There you are. I should have known you'd be reading again." "She told me stories," the girl said, pointing at Eleanor. "Good ones?" The woman's eyes lingered, kind but curious. "Are you a teacher?" Eleanor tilted her head. "I was something like that." There was no need to elaborate. The woman nodded, accepting the answer not as vague, but as whole. The girl rummaged through her backpack, pulled out a small spiral notebook and held it out. "I drew something. It's for you." Eleanor opened the notebook. Inside a simple pencil sketch, an older woman sitting on a bench beneath a flowering tree, hands in her lap, eyes looking forward. Underneath, in careful lettering, "I want to grow up like her." The breeze caught the edge of the page, but Eleanor held it still. No corporate title, no etched brass, no framed certificates, just a drawing and a sentence. She looked at the tree, at the blooms, at the way the petals held on even when the wind pressed hard. No one remembers the name on the plaque, but someone remembers the woman on the bench. They erased her name from the boardroom, rewrote the bylaws, and toasted their triumph without her. But in the quiet bloom of spring, far from applause and golden plaques, someone still remembered the woman who built everything without needing to reclaim it. Justice may arrive late, but it resonates like the final chord of a long-forgotten melody, clear, undeniable, and irreversible. Because sometimes all it takes is one unshaken voice to remind the world truth doesn't retire. If this story moved, you don't hesitate to share your thoughts or reflections in the comments below. And if you believe more stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe to Heavy Stories and help us bring justice to light.